There is a kind of person who walks into a room and already knows what happened before anyone speaks. They do not ask. They do not interrogate. They simply stand at the edge of the gathering, quiet and still. And within minutes, they have mapped the invisible architecture of every relationship present. Who is angry? Who is afraid? Who is pretending? Who is drowning behind a rehearsed smile? They say nothing, and because they say nothing, everyone around them assumes they are passive, distant, perhaps even unintelligent, perhaps cold. This is the great misreading of our time. By the end of this video, you will understand three things. You will understand why the silence of the solitary empath is not absence. It is a form of perception so precise that most people cannot even recognize it as perception. You will understand what Carl Jung described as the capacity to receive what the collective unconscious transmits, the reason some people seem to know what was never told to them. And you will understand what it costs to carry this kind of awareness through a world that has decided silence means emptiness. This is not a video about being shy. It is not a video about introversion as a personality quirk or a social inconvenience. It is a video about a specific and rare form of psychological depth, one that society has systematically mistaken for weakness for centuries. And the person who most needs to hear this is probably the person who almost did not click on it. You are not empty. You have been overflowing, and no one taught you the difference. You know what it is to enter a conversation and say almost nothing while simultaneously processing everything. You notice the slight tension in someone's voice when they say they are fine. You notice the moment a person's laughter shifts register, when it goes from real to performed. You notice the things people reach for when they are nervous, the glass they didn't intend to pick up, the sentence they started and quietly abandoned midway. You notice these things not because you are watching for them. You notice them because you cannot stop noticing. The signal comes in whether you want it to or not. What you have been told about this is that you are overthinking, that you are too sensitive, that you are projecting, that you are reading into things that are not there. You have been told this so many times by so many people that some part of you began to believe it. You learned to distrust the very instrument that knows the most. You learned to call your clearest perception a flaw. In Jungian psychology, the framework for understanding this begins with what Jung described in his 1921 work, Psychological Types, a mapping of how human beings orient themselves toward the world. Jung proposed that some people are fundamentally directed inward, not as a retreat from reality, but as a primary mode of contact with it. The introverted type, as Jung described, does not first engage with the external world and then draw meaning from it. The introverted type begins from within, from image, impression, and felt sense, and moves outward from there. This is not a deficit of engagement. It is a different axis of engagement entirely. And within this framework, Jung identified something rarer still. The person whose introversion is combined with an acute feeling function, what he described as introverted feeling. In his direct language from Psychological Types, Jung wrote that of this type, the proverb "still waters run deep" is profoundly true. They are mostly silent, inaccessible, hard to understand. They neither shine nor reveal themselves. Their depth, he observed, can only be guessed at by those on the outside. Think of a lake, whose surface is almost perfectly still. You could mistake it for shallow. You could be deceived by its composure, its seeming passivity, its refusal to announce itself with waves. But beneath that surface, the water reaches down into darkness that no passing glance can measure. This is not a metaphor for hidden emotion. It is a description of a different relationship between inside and outside, one where the most significant events happen below the visible line, and the surface reveals almost nothing of the depth it conceals. What you live in is not a personality trait. It is a mode of perceiving the world that most people around you do not share, and it has never been the problem you were told it was. Society has a deep structural preference for what is legible, what can be spoken, demonstrated, performed, quantified, and displayed. From the earliest years of organized schooling, children are rewarded for what they say, what they raise their hand to answer, what they project into the room. Silence, in the architecture of collective life, has been coded as absence, as disengagement, as the sign of someone who has nothing to offer. This is not an accident of culture. It is a function of what psychologists call the extroverted bias of Western industrial civilization, the collective pressure to perform one's interiority, to show your knowing, to demonstrate your caring, to broadcast your perception, is not merely a social preference. Research in developmental psychology has consistently documented that children who are quiet and observational are more likely to be overlooked for leadership, misread as less intelligent, and described by authority figures as withdrawn or unmotivated, even when their internal processing is more sophisticated than that of their louder peers. The world does not know how to read what does not announce itself. This is not a small injustice, it is a systemic one. And Carl Jung understood its dimensions well. Jung himself was a deeply introverted child, raised in a parish in rural Switzerland, who described in his autobiography memories, dreams, reflections, the painful sense of living with two persons inside himself, one who could navigate the social world and one who belonged to something far older and deeper. He described the introverted intuitive type as often appearing as seers, prophets, artists, figures whom the collective could not categorize and therefore could not tolerate. Throughout history, the person who perceives without speaking has been branded as strange, as aloof, as suspicious. The witch who says nothing but knows everything, the outsider who sees through the performance, the child who is too quiet and therefore must be broken or opened or explained. What has been done to you is not a correction of something wrong in your nature. It is the application of a collective pressure to conform to a single mode of knowing, the spoken, the demonstrated, the extroverted. The world built its systems for people who process out loud, and it has spent centuries telling those who process in silence that they are broken. They are not broken. They are operating on a frequency the majority does not receive. But staying unconscious of what you carry has a cost, and the cost is not theoretical. It lives in the body. It lives in the years of muted confidence, of second-guessing what you knew clearly. It lives in the relationships where you gave everything you perceived, without ever naming what the perception cost you. It lives in the exhaustion that follows social encounters, where you absorbed the emotional atmosphere of an entire room, while appearing, to everyone present, to simply be standing quietly at the edge of things. Research on what psychologists call sensory processing sensitivity, first documented and named by psychologist Elaine Aron, has observed that approximately 15 to 20% of the human population demonstrates a nervous system that processes emotional and sensory information at a markedly deeper level than average. Studies using functional brain imaging have found that in this population, the regions associated with emotional awareness, empathy, and the interpretation of social meaning show consistently higher activation. Even in the presence of strangers, these individuals do not merely notice emotional signals more readily, they process them more completely, more deeply, and at a cost to their own resources that the non-sensitive individual simply does not incur. This research frames what you may have spent years calling a flaw as something else entirely. But knowledge without integration does not protect you. You can read every study on sensitivity and still return to a life where you exhaust yourself for others who do not notice, where you absorb the weight of rooms you were not invited to carry, where you mistake your perception of someone else's pain for an obligation to solve it. There is a woman, call her Nadia, who had spent most of her adult life being the person others came to in crisis, not because she invited it, not because she announced herself as available, but because something in her presence communicated that she would understand, that she would hold it, that it would be safe there. She understood without being told what people needed, and she gave it, freely, quietly, without keeping accounts. By the time she was 34, she had not spent a single year of her adult life without at least one other person's crisis anchored at the center of it. She was not unhappy exactly, but she was not herself either. She had become a vessel so habituated to holding others that she had lost contact with what she herself contained. What does it cost to carry perception without boundaries? It costs you the ability to know, over time, where you end and others begin. And when you lose that boundary, when you no longer know which feelings are yours and which you have absorbed from the room, you lose access to the very faculty that made you extraordinary to begin with. Here is what Jung would have you understand about the silence you carry. What society calls disconnection, what family calls coldness, what peers call withdrawal, what employers call passivity, is, in Jung's framework, something entirely different. It is the expression of a perceptual function so deep and so precise that it has nowhere to go in a culture that only values what is spoken. In Jungian psychology, the introverted feeling type is described as someone whose depth of feeling can only be guessed at by others, because its expression is not outward performance, but inward intensity. Jung observed in psychological types that an intensive sympathy, being shut off from every conventional means of expression, acquires a passionate depth that comprises a whole world of experience. What this type feels, they feel completely. What they know through the body and the image before they know it through the word. Their silence is not a deficit. It is the natural condition of a perception that runs too deep for casual language. And here is the inversion that changes everything. What the world has called your coldness is your fire contained. What the world has called your distance is your closeness turned inward. What the world has called your passivity is your precision. The kind of perception that does not speak because speaking would reduce what it sees. Not distance, not disinterest, but a depth the surface cannot hold. Jung proposed that the introverted intuitive type, the person whose primary orientation is toward the inner world and its images, has what he described as a private line to the collective unconscious. The structures and movements of the deeper psyche, which most people access only in dreams or in moments of crisis, are closer to the surface for this type. They are available in waking life as felt impressions, sudden knowings, atmospheric readings of situations that have not yet declared themselves. This is not mysticism. It is, in Jung's framework, a specific and documentable mode of psychological function, one that processes meaning through image and feeling rather than through spoken logic. Think of the difference between a compass and a map. Most people navigate using the map, the explicit, agreed-upon visible representation of where things are. But the compass does not need the map. It points without explanation. It does not persuade or demonstrate. It simply orients. The solitary empath does not navigate by what has been spoken. They navigate by a compass that was calibrated somewhere so deep inside that they cannot even fully explain how it works. They only know that it does. And they have spent years being told the compass is broken, when in fact they were surrounded by people who had never learned to read it. What you know without being told is not a coincidence. It is not projection. It is not overthinking. It is a mode of perception as real as any other, and more ancient than most. There is a phenomenon in the study of emotional perception that points toward what we are describing. Research has documented that individuals with heightened empathic sensitivity demonstrate not only greater activation in brain regions associated with social processing, but also a specific capacity sometimes described as emotional contagion, the involuntary mirroring of another person's internal state. This is not metaphor, it is a neurological reality. The mirror neuron systems of these individuals are not simply more active. They are active in response to emotional states that are not yet visible on the surface. They receive what has not yet been expressed. This is why you sometimes know what someone is feeling before they know it themselves. This is why you are exhausted by rooms that appear calm but are not. This is why the person who seems to be simply watching from the corner is actually doing something extraordinarily complex, absorbing, interpreting, mapping the invisible emotional geography of everything present. Consider the geology of deep water. What registers on the surface of the ocean, the waves, the weather, the visible churn, is produced by forces operating far below. The pressure systems that move beneath the thermocline miles down create weather on the surface without ever being seen. The person who can read the surface waves and intuit what is occurring at depth, who can hear the shift before the storm, is not doing something mysterious. They are doing something scientifically specific. They are detecting the signal that the less sensitive cannot yet perceive. There is a man, call him Marcus, who had spent most of his life being told he was too quiet to be trusted with leadership. He was thoughtful in meetings where others spoke first and fastest. He consistently read a room before he entered it, lingering at the threshold of doors longer than others, adjusting something in himself before he came in. His colleagues called this hesitation. His supervisors called it a lack of confidence, but the people he worked closest with knew something different. They came to him when they needed to understand what was actually happening, not the official version, not the stated position, but the truth beneath the performance. He knew it unfailingly, and he knew it without needing to ask. He had never understood why this was true of him. He had only understood gradually that it was. If you have ever felt this knowing that you cannot explain and that the world around you does not validate, leave a comment below. Just a word. You are not alone in this. One day Marcus was moved to a new team, led by a director whose manner was warm, confident, and universally admired. Within his first week, Marcus felt something he could not name. A coldness beneath the warmth, a calculation beneath the openness. He said nothing. He had no evidence. He had only the signal, the compass, the reading that could not be translated into the language of the map. 2 years later, the director's quiet campaign to undermine several members of the team became visible to everyone. The warmth had always been a performance. Marcus had known it from week one. Not because he was suspicious by nature, but because the instrument he carried read what the surface did not show. He had spent those 2 years wondering if he was wrong. He spent them silencing the compass because no one else could hear it. This is what it costs to distrust what you are. But here is what must also be said. The transformation that is available to the solitary empath is not the transformation into someone louder, someone more expressive, someone who performs their knowing for the room. That would not be transformation. That would be capitulation. That would be putting down the compass and learning to use the map, and the map is not what you are made of. What must die, and the word is accurate, not hyperbolic, is the version of yourself that apologizes for the depth, the version that has learned to preface its perceptions with disclaimers, the version that says, maybe I'm wrong, before saying what it knows with complete clarity, the version that absorbs everyone else's weight without asking whether it was offered or simply deposited, the version that has conflated sensitivity with servitude. This is a psychological death. It is the death of the adapted self, the persona in Jung's framework, that was constructed specifically to make your depth tolerable to others, to make your silence explicable, to make your knowing less threatening. This persona was not invented from nothing. It was built over years in response to real pressure from a real world that did not know how to hold what you are. It served a function. It protected you. And it also quietly and steadily cost you your capacity to trust yourself. Jung knew this process from the inside. Following his documented break with Sigmund Freud in 1913, Jung entered what he later described in Memories, Dreams, Reflections as a period of profound inner crisis, a confrontation with the unconscious that was, by his own account, nearly overwhelming. He did not retreat from it. He descended into it deliberately, recording his visions and dialogues with inner figures in the manuscripts that would eventually become his Red Book. He built his tower at Bollingen, the stone structure on the shore of Lake Zurich, as a physical embodiment of his need for solitude and inner contact. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he wrote directly, "In Bollingen, silence surrounds me almost audibly." He was not escaping the world. He was going deep enough into himself to find what the world could not give him, the language for what he already knew. What Jung surrendered in that process was the professional identity, the intellectual allegiance, and the social belonging that his relationship with Freud had provided. The death was real, the cost was real, and what emerged on the other side was also real, a framework for the human psyche that still shapes our understanding of it more than a century later. Jung would tell you that the persona, the mask constructed to make you acceptable, must eventually be released not because it was false, but because it has become too small. The self, in Jung's framework, is not the persona. It is the totality of the psyche, the whole of what you are, including the depth that the surface has never shown. The individuation process, which Jung proposed as the central task of psychological development, is not about becoming more. It is about becoming whole. It requires the willingness to let what was built for survival be surrendered for something more authentic. And that surrender is not comfortable. It never is. What becomes possible? not guaranteed, not immediate, but possible, is a life in which the depth you carry is not a burden you manage in silence, but a faculty you have learned to inhabit with clarity and with deliberate boundary. What emerges is not someone who no longer perceives. You will not stop receiving the signal. The compass does not turn off. What emerges is someone who has learned to know which perceptions belong to action, which belong to witness, and which belong to the release of what was never yours to carry. This is not a small distinction. It is the difference between drowning in a river and knowing how to read a current. What becomes possible is the quality of presence that is, in the world's language, rare. The capacity to sit with someone in their truth without needing to fix it, perform it, or absorb it entirely. To know without collapsing, to feel without dissolving, to understand what is beneath the surface of a room or a relationship without being swallowed by it. Research consistently finds that individuals who have developed this regulated form of empathic depth are among the most effective presences in therapeutic, creative, and relational fields. Not despite their sensitivity, but through it, once it has been made conscious and held with skill. There is a specific kind of ease that begins to emerge, not the ease of those who feel little, but the ease of those who feel everything and have learned to stand inside it without being swept away. The river still moves. You simply know how to plant your feet. There is a woman who spent 3 decades believing her quietness was a deficiency, who eventually came to understand it as the condition of her most significant capacities, and who built a life around the fact that she could read what others could not see. She did not become louder. She became more precisely herself, and everything that had felt like a liability became the instrument she was always meant to use. The solitary empath does not arrive one day in a world that finally understands them. That world may not come. What arrives instead is the capacity to stop needing it to carry the depth without apology, to say nothing and to know, without requiring confirmation, that the silence is not absence, that it has never been absence, that it is, and always has been, the most complete form of attention you know how to give. The still water runs deep, and eventually the person who lives in that depth stops waiting to be discovered by those who only know how to read the surface. You are not broken because you say less than others. You are not behind because your knowing is internal before it is spoken. You are not wrong for the weight of what you carry in silence, and you are not cold because the fire is contained in a place the casual eye cannot see. What you are going through, this long education in the cost of depth in a world built for surfaces, is not a sign that something went wrong with you. It is a sign that something in you was built for a different order of engagement, and that the work now is not to dismantle it, but to inhabit it with full consciousness of what it is, to know the compass for what it is, to trust the signal that has never, in the end, steered you wrong, even when you spent years pretending you had not heard it. If this gave language to something you have been living in silence, share it with someone who is living the same thing but has no words for it yet. That person is probably also saying nothing. That person also already knows. They need to know they are not alone.